really don't know. I mean, I was quite surprised when I got called cyberpunk. You know, I was like, oh, all right. I can see why, because obviously there's a direct line back to William Gibson's work. You know, Blade Runner was a big influence on me. These are cyberpunk classics. So, but you know, there are other elements of the work that don't seem to fit in with it. Like, so cyberpunk, a lot of the time in cyberpunk, the protagonists are usually very young, which is not the case in most of my work. They tend to be the exact opposite. They tend to be older and more fed up with life. So I don't know. I mean, I think the point about genre and subgenres is that you've got to be careful not to turn them into straitjackets. You know, so it's like when you say, oh, it's a cyberpunk novel, that can be a useful reference point, because you go, okay, I've got some idea now what that's about. I don't think it pays to be too obsessive about that stuff, you know. I think for me, it begins and ends with the human element. So, you know, for me, the storytelling is always going to be about the people in the story. And once you decide that, it doesn't much matter what your environment is. So when I wrote the fantasy trilogy, I didn't change that much. You know, my style was the same. A lot of the content was the same. You know, obviously the furniture of the story had to be different because it's a different environment. You got no spaceships, you got swords instead of guns, you know, things like that. But that I think is relatively superficial, because what the stories are about in human terms, that tends to be the same for me. It's like, well, I'm just writing the stories that I think address these certain human issues, and if that is cyberpunk, well, great. But if it's something you want to call it something else, that's fine by me, you know. And I tend to see myself as a kind of I guess as a kind of anti-Disney, in that I think that there you know, there's a lot of fiction out there, and you know, Disney and Marvel and DC are a big part of that, which is selling this idea of the world that is very wholesome and nice, and has actually no resemblance to the way the world really is. And so I guess to an extent what I'm interested in doing is writing science fiction stories, fantasy stories that refuse to do that, that refuse to eliminate the you know, the realistic human element. So I'm, you know, in terms of what the content is, I'm interested in moral ambiguity, a morally grey sense of you're not really sure who the good guys or the bad guys actually are. Maybe there's no such thing as the good guys or the bad guys. You know, that things don't change that much at a human level. Humans behave the way that humans have always behaved, and the technology will inform that, but it isn't going to make humans into some other species, or at least not yet. You know? Well, I think this is an interesting question, because they are heroes, but they're heroes in the classical mode. Because if you look back at the history of heroes, you look at the Odyssey, the Iliad, look at the Viking sagas, you know, the Greek myths, all those heroes, by the standards of Hollywood, by the standards of today, those heroes behave incredibly badly. You know, they are not nice men. They are not, you know, fine, decent members of their community, and there's usually a problem with them. They're dangerous or unbalanced, or, you know, and I think that's because the Greeks, the Vikings, all these cultures, they understood that there's nothing safe about violence. There's nothing comfortable about it. And the problem, I think, with the Hollywood model is we desperately want to make everything comfortable and easy to digest. So your heroes must be heroic, and heroic means that they must be good. And, you know, very often you have these stories in which a guy will go and do the most horrific things in the story, and then at the end he goes back to his home and his wife, and he settles down with his family, and he has this beautiful middle American, middle class existence. And my experience of how the world works is that that's not possible. You know, that if you are a man of violence, if you belong to a profession of violence, it's extremely difficult for you to then put yourself back in the box of, you know, living the good life. And that's something that doesn't get addressed enough. The first war movie that I saw about the Second World War that I really felt sort of addressed that myth was Fury, with Brad Pitt. So it's a very recent movie. It's taken us from 1945 until now to start telling honest stories about the Second World War, you know, to say it wasn't a heroic story in which, you know, there was this evil and we defeated the evil and then everyone just went home. It's like, no, that's not what happened, you know. It wasn't that. But you can't find movies about the Second World War that really deal with that until very, very, very recently. Even Saving Private Ryan, you know, there's an element of unpleasantness, the sense of how unpleasant war is, but still, those guys, those American guys, they're wonderful guys, and they're trying to rescue this other wonderful guy to take him home to his family, and you're like, yeah, okay, there's a story there, but it doesn't deal with what the war really was about. And I think Fury was the first time I'd ever seen the real attempt to address it, to go, no, look, it was fucking horrible. Even if you were on the right side, even if you were winning the war, it was still a mess. It was still morally repugnant and absolutely devastating for the men who took part and the women who were dragged into it as well, obviously. The hero narrative, you know, needs that dark half, because if you don't tell the story with the dark half included, then we go on making the same mistakes. People genuinely believe that, oh yeah, join the army, kill a few guys, come home and have a family, it's fine, you know, and you know, that's clearly not what the world is. That's not how these things work. So I think my characters, yeah, they're absolutely heroes in the Greek sense, in the Viking sense of being heroes, but in terms of Hollywood heroes, no, absolutely not. And in fact, Hollywood has had to invent the anti-hero in order to try and deal with that aspect of of heroism. You know, most of the guys that are in the Viking sagas, most of the guys in the Greek myths, they would, in Hollywood terms, they would count as anti-heroes. You know, and you're starting very slowly to see those stories getting told. You know, the Neil Gaiman animated Beowulf, for example, was an attempt to examine that. There have been a certain number of movies where they've tried to go into that, but you know, generally speaking, Hollywood, it kind of dominates the cultural narrative when it comes to hero stories so much that I think we're losing sight of what hero stories really are, because they're not happy stories. You know, they don't end well. I think when you go back and look at the myths and legends of most cultures, there is inspiration there. I mean, because you can usually find the same basic human stories being told over and over again. So there is inspiration there. But to be honest, you can find that inspiration in other places as well. If you read true life stories of guys who were in the Second World War, for example, or in Vietnam, or in Afghanistan, with those kind of narratives, if you're prepared to look, you can find them, and you find the sort of the truth of what that is, but you've got to look for it. You know, Hollywood is not interested in selling it to you. You know, transhumanism had been talking for a long time about this wonderful future in which we would transcend our physical selves and we would, become something else. And I was looking at it, I was thinking, well, I don't think that's what's going to happen. The telling statistic is we live in a world in which logistically no child ever needs to starve to death. You know, we have the productive capacity, we have the logistical distribution technology to ensure that never happens. Okay, we can do it in sheer physical terms, but we don't. And for me, that's, yeah, we're trying. We're better than we were. You know, don't get me wrong. I'm not a total pessimist. We're trying, but we haven't done that. And the reason we haven't done that is not because we can't. It's because of who we are. You know, and so my sense of it was, yeah, you can have your transhumanist technology and your brave new world in which you can swap bodies and put your consciousness in a machine and all this stuff. It isn't going to make any difference. that's not what you're not going to get a better world because of that. You'll get a different world, but it isn't going to be better. It's going to, unless you are interested in the moral concerns, the machinery of regulation and of law and order, of living in a society of law. Unless you're concerned with those things, then it'll be exactly the same. It will be the same nightmare that we have now, that we've always had. And I think that was my attempt to sort of tell that story, to say, look at the future. It's no different. Everyone wants to live forever, it's that simple. It was another look at the immortality myth, but done in a very, very pragmatic way. It was like, you can be immortal and it's not a fairy tale. Here is how you actually do it, and they a lot of people, I think, missed the fact it was a dystopia, but then also because in many ways it's altered carbon. I mean, I wrote the book I wanted to read, and I love dark anti-hero narratives. And I think a lot of other people do as well. We all like stories of sex and violence. We all like stories in which there's a kind of level of emotional desperation, and that surviving is the thing. And if it's really, the struggle is to survive. First season, I loved it, because although they changed some things, although it is significantly different in some ways, they honoured the book. So there's almost nothing in the novel that doesn't appear in that TV show in some shape or form. I look at Joel Kinnaman playing Kovac in that show. I look at, and the other guys as well, and especially Kinnaman. Kinnaman really understood what I'd written, I think, because he read the book. The second season, not so much, because they took it in some different directions. And although I think, Anthony Mackie's a great actor, and he turned in a really good performance, but it's just, I look at him and I'm like, I don't recognise that guy. That's not my Kovac. But it's one of the things that the show did for me, for which I'm eternally grateful, is that by existing, it made everything else that I'd written suddenly of interest to people in Hollywood, in the movie industry generally. They're all being, there are people working on the fantasy trilogy, Land Fit for Heroes. They're trying to get that made. I haven't heard anything about that for probably about 6 months now, so I don't know where they are with that. But it's on. That's they're pushing for it, and I've just heard that there's a group of producers who are interested in taking Market Forces forward as and they so there's a lot still going on. But it's rolling the dice. Whether or not you can get the finance, get the film pushed through, get the show made, that remains to be seen. Well, I think, I think there's a kind of unified enthusiasm in storytelling, and I think if you can tell a story in one medium, then you can learn to tell the story in another medium, and all you have to do, I think, is when you cross over to the new medium, is you have to bring with you a sense of humility. You have a sense of understanding that this is not your backyard anymore. It's another place. There are new rules, and you have to learn what those rules are. So, like when I started writing Black Widow for Marvel, I didn't read that many comics anyway. I certainly didn't know how to write one, and I was very lucky in that the editor who hired me walked me through. She gave me essentially classes in how to do a good comic. Same thing in a sense with game writing, is that it's a totally different arena, and the one with game writing, what's interesting is that the story is usually not the main thing. The story is a support pillar for the game experience, and it's actually things like core gameplay dynamics. Those are really the main feature of the game. So you need to learn that, and you have to learn, as well as obviously learning how you can tell a story in games, but also you have to learn that you are not the hero of the piece in the same way you would be as a novelist. It's much more a teamwork thing. But again, if you come to it with the right attitude, if you come to it with the right approach, you go, right, well, here are the stories, here are the things I want to say, here are the stories I want to tell. How do I do that in this other medium? And you just have to pay attention and think about it. I really liked Black Widow, and I would love to go back, but there's no way. Marvel will never let me near Black Widow again. There's no way. They're not going to let me near that character again. No way. Especially now that she's such a big deal. She's become a major figure in the Marvel universe, because what I wrote was not what they were looking for. They didn't want the Black Widow that I created, and it was it wasn't very successful. In Marvel terms, it didn't sell very well, and there's no way they're going to, they'll just go, no, back off, Richard. There's no way they'd let me near her. But I really loved the character, and I still think there's a lot you could do with it that Marvel haven't done and will never do, because they've got a target audience. They know what the target audience wants, and so the level of engagement is always going to be tailored to that. So my Black Widow was a lot more hard-boiled than the one that you see now. She was tired, bitter, a little bit older. It's like when they rebooted James Bond in Casino Royale, and for the first time you saw his fists were torn up where he'd been fighting, and that was what I wanted for Black Widow. I was looking for something to physicalize it and to make it real in the same way as that, and they don't want that. Marvel don't want that. It's a superhero. It's a superhero story, and you don't draw attention to how unpleasant violence is in superhero stories. Apart from that, I don't know. I can't think of any characters offhand that really appeal. Again, the problem is that the comic book form is so dominated by Marvel and DC that it's very hard to think of characters outside of that context. And even the ones that exist outside of it, they tend to bend towards the same idea. So, for example, Alan Moore's characters in Watchmen. And although that is a very different kind of superhero story, it still leans into the superhero ethos, I don't think I've never really been an appropriate writer for superheroes, because I don't like them. Well, I think something has changed very definitely in the last 20 years, in the sense that we are now living in a science fiction universe. Even back in the 90s, you could argue that wasn't really true. Most ordinary people say, oh yeah, science fiction, that's like Star Wars and stuff, isn't it? Yeah, don't really like that stuff. It was still very much a minority dynamic, yeah. And now it's everything. All of the big game franchises, all of the big superhero franchises, they live and breathe science fiction, and also the extent to which technology is the speed that technology is moving now is science fictional. I remember watching Elon Musk's booster rockets return to the pad and land, and I didn't believe when I saw that. I thought it was trick photography. As somebody reversing the footage. It's like, no, they actually do that. So I think that's the first thing. I think we've gone from a time in which science fiction was an interesting lens through which you could examine contemporary reality, and now it is the only lens we have. And anybody writing, forget science fiction writers, any writer now, if they genuinely want to address the state of the world, they have to be able to at least speak science fiction. Maybe they aren't a science fiction writer, and maybe they won't write a book that you would classically consider science fiction, but they have to be fluent in the idiom of science fiction, because it's the only way to address the world the way it is at the moment. So it always amuses me when you get somebody writing in maybe the New York Times and sort of saying, oh, science fiction, but that's not real literature, or something like that. And those guys, they're like the Japanese soldiers they found on these islands in the Pacific in the 1960s, still fighting the Second World War, and you're like, no, guys, the war is over. The battle for acceptance for science fiction is over, and we've won. We dominate now. It is a science fiction world, and the whole of art and literature, film, video games, all of it is inflected in science fictional terms. It's a great time to be writing. Really. Well, I think one of the things that is very clear is going to happen now, and it's going to happen quite soon, is, we're going to Mars. Quite how many of us and for how long is a different question, but we're going to Mars, we're going back to the moon. You know, space exploration is front and center now. It's going to be a thing. And I'm interested in exploring that, but not from the sort of wide-eyed Elon Musk, you know, teenager vision of it. For me, it's much more about, yeah, but what does that actually mean? If we go to Mars and Elon Musk sets up a colony on Mars, what does that mean in human terms? What does that mean for the people living there? You know, I think it's SpaceX have already said that they want to set up colonies that don't obey international law. That they are going to have a series of self-governing principles. And you're like, oh, self-governing principles. Tell me more about your self-governing principles. What's that going to be? You know, is Elon Musk emperor? You know, what? You know, and that is, for me, it's not about the technology that gets you to Mars. It's about, yeah, but when we get there, what is that going to be like? How will we behave? What will we be allowed to do, for example, in this brave new Martian colony? What happens if you don't like it and you want to go home? Because it's very expensive to send people to Mars. It's even more expensive to bring them back. And you know, what's going to happen with that? So the Thin Air, my last novel, and the one that I'm writing a sequel to it now, called Gone Machine. Those books are about that. They're about, yeah, Mars. Okay, we're there. We're there. Now what? You know? And I think, in a sense, my whole interest in science fiction, you can boil it down to those two words. Okay, now what? You know, because the truth of the matter is, it doesn't matter how good your technology is. It doesn't matter how shiny what you're doing is. At the human level, you know, you need to look at these things. And you know, when I see that the people in charge of the future at the moment are, you know, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, you know, I'm not reassured. You know, because I know that Amazon seem to be improving their terms and conditions for their employees, but you know, not that much. And you know, I know that Musk is, you know, he's a kid, and he's done some amazing things, and I wouldn't want to in any way take away from that. But he is a kid at heart, and he doesn't see the sort of the dark heart of humanity. He doesn't get what can go wrong, and that's a problem. That's a big problem. And that's what I think. That's what interests me. I'm interested in let's tell the story. Never mind the story of how we get to Mars. That's cool. Yeah. Someone else can tell that story. I'm interested in telling the story of, right, we get to Mars, and what now? What goes wrong? You know, because it will go wrong, because we're humans and we always fuck up. You know. Well, you know what? I was just going to say, because it's not usually a reaction like, you know, oh, I really like this thing in your novel. Okay, it's usually more sort of basic emotional things. So like, I remember quite a few years ago, I was at a convention in Belgium that's called Trolls and Legends, and I was sitting there, and I wasn't getting much traffic. I was sitting to sign books. Nobody was really paying attention to me, and then suddenly this guy comes past, young Belgian guy, and he comes past and he looks at the books, and one of the books was Still Remains, which I'm sure you probably know. It has a gay protagonist. Yeah, right. So this guy, from the look, I'm guessing he was gay. I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing he was. He comes past, he sees the book, and he stops, and he comes back to me and he says, "You write this book? You write this book?" And I'm like, yeah, that's me, I wrote this book. Takes my hand and shakes it and he goes, thank you for writing this book, you know? And then he went away. He didn't buy a copy. He went, and I'm like, wow, okay, that's enough for me, you know? Because obviously that book spoke to, I don't know if it, like I said, I don't know if he was gay, it might have been something else, but that book spoke to that guy at some level, that he was grateful that I wrote it. And you're like, when something like that happens to you, you're like, you know, it really blows you away. And this happened to me again today in Kiev, because I was doing a signing, and suddenly this guy presents himself, and he had to get a translator because he didn't speak any English. He bought a couple of books to be signed, and he said, or the translator said, he wants to tell you he's come from Donetsk for these books. And I went, what, today he's come from Donetsk? She said, yeah. And he had come from Donetsk to Kiev specifically to see me and get these books signed. And again, you're like, wow. Okay, that's a big fucking deal, you know. A guy crosses half, and Ukraine's not a small country, you know. This guy crosses half a country to come and get me to sign these books, and he doesn't even speak my language. That is a big deal for me, you know. That really says something to me. So it's those kind of moments where you realize that what you've written has meant something to somebody, you know. Here, you know, it's not about, I really loved this idea, it was super cool or whatever. No, it's not that. It's when, for whatever reasons, that you got somebody here, you got them in the heart, you know, in the soul, and that's why I do it. You know, I mean, I'm trying to communicate. I'm trying to get the talk to people, and when that happens, you go, right, with that guy, I succeeded. I managed to talk to that guy.